Sir? He did a great job. Thank you. We really do appreciate it. What a great help. Mark chapter 15, while you're turning there, boy, you think about that song, Where Could I Go But to the Lord, and it tied into this morning's message, the unseen hand, the hand of God, how He works in our life. I'm not going to re-preach it. Y'all already heard it, so I don't need to preach it again, at least not for a couple weeks. I'll wait till you forget about it, and then I'll bring it up again. It's amazing to me how God works in our life, isn't it? You know, you just go through and so many trials and we face so many different things, but it never ceases to amaze me how God works. And looking back in my own life and the different things that I've gone through, the different, I call them adventures, but the different adventures God takes me through, and His hand is always there. And then you get into the next one, the next stage of life, whatever it may be, and you can look back and say, hey, you know, God took care of me here. I think I'll be okay over here. He's going to take care of me. And always having Him there to go to during those times of trouble and trials. And I was thinking about it as we were singing, Where Could I Go But to the Lord? And we're getting into some may view this part of the Gospels as a sad part. We're looking at Jesus' trial and His crucifixion and going to the cross, and sometimes it infuriates me when I read it to think why people would do this to my Lord and Savior, and yet we read so many times as you go through here that Jesus mentions it must be, it has to take place. The cup can't pass from me. I have to go through this. It's part of why, in fact, we'll read tonight, He'll say this is why I was here, it's why I was born, was for this time, for this crucifixion, for this sacrifice. And just thinking about what Jesus did for us. And reading through it, we looked at it last week, and I told Brother Dennis, I said, you missed out. We were like an hour and a half long last week. He goes, well, I'm glad I wasn't here. Don't worry, I don't think we're going to be that long tonight. In fact, I might let you out early to take up for the time that we used last week, and I don't think anybody's going to complain about that one. But we were going through last week, and man, what an event to see where Jesus was taken and arrested in the garden, and then He went before the chief priests and the elders, and He's in front of them, and they're accusing Him and bringing in false witnesses, and all these things are going on. And here is God Almighty standing in front of men. And men are treating Him and falsely accusing Him, and He does nothing. That blows my mind. The love of God for mankind is right there. You see it right there. Yeah, we see it on the cross where He sacrificed Himself. And we see that happening. But it starts right there. Because He could have called angels down, and He could have just thought it and then been over, been done. That had been done away with. But He goes through all of this for us so that mankind can be saved. What an amazing thought as we go through this and we look at it. We continue on, and Peter has denied Christ 3 times. He's left the chief priest's place and has gone out and cried bitterly because of his denial, and rightly so. I think any one of us would have done the same thing once we realized what we had done. I think sometimes too we not in a sense deny Christ, but we don't live our life according to His word, and we become like Peter in some aspects. I don't know about you, but when I see sin in my life, there's times where the conviction hits me and I go, I just get bitter or tore up about it, because I think here I am, supposed to be a child of God and an obedient child of His, and yet I'm sinning against Him, and I'm doing these things, and I know it displeases my Father, and it really tears at me. And I understand Peter's need to weep and to go out, and sometimes we need to be that way. We need to be broken of those things. And we get into chapter number 15, and you may have looked there and looked at the verses. There's only about 5 verses here that we're going to look at in the book of Mark. But I warned you this morning, Mark doesn't give us a lot of commentary on this, but the other Gospels do, especially Luke. Luke gives us quite a bit. So if you want to, maybe go over to Matthew chapter 27. We're going to be there, and put a piece of paper in there, or if you got an extra one of these nice ribbons, you can put one of those there. Or if like me, Miss Winnie gave me these because I was struggling one Sunday finding references. And she gave me these neat little paper tabs, and now I use them all the time. In fact, one Sunday, I think I had like 6 or 7 of them in my Bible, and then I forgot which tab was which one. And yeah, that didn't work too well. But if you have some way to mark your Bible and keep your place there, because we're going to kind of move around through these different books, Matthew chapter 27, then we're going to be looking in Luke chapter 22, and it'll be the end of it, so don't go to chapter 22 and verse 1, because we're going to go all the way down to verse 66 and go from there. And then also in John chapter 18. So we're going to look at all 4 Gospels tonight at this account. I started into it and I was reading it and I was like, well, it's only 5 verses. What are we going to preach on out of 5 verses? And it just talks about Jesus standing before Pilate. And I'm like, that's going to be a little bit of a stretch to get a good sermon out of that. And I don't like stretching the Bible to make a good sermon. I don't think that's the right way to do that. And so I started reading the other Gospels as I normally do as we go through here. And I saw the accounts that were given, especially in Luke. And I said, you know what? I think tonight I'm going to break character a little bit because I like to stay in the book that we're studying and just look at it. But I think tonight will do us good to see the whole picture by going to all of the Gospels. So if you'll just stay with me for a little bit, I think we'll be able to make it. If you get sleepy, Brother Doug gave me some hot peppers this morning. And I left them in my coat pocket. And I got here tonight, Brother Doug, and I was feeling around for something. I went, what is that? And I was like, oh, those are those hot peppers. So they're sitting up here. So if you get sleepy, I'll bring one down. You can nibble on that, and you'll be all right. You'll make it through the rest of the service after you get a gallon of water to fix that problem. All right, so Mark chapter number 15. Let's read verse 1 through 5, and then we'll get into the message. And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answereth, said unto him, Thou sayest it. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Wow. Once again, you look at this, and we'll just kind of look over this. Isn't part of the message yet. But we look over this and we think, here's Jesus standing before Pilate, the governor of the area. And we'll see his title in explanation later on. And here he is, and the chief priests accuse him and go into accusations against him. And even Pilate asks, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, Thou sayest it, and doesn't answer a thing. Pilate questions him some more, still doesn't answer a thing. Here Jesus could have taken care of business, per se, and dealt with all of these men. And all these men think they have power. They only have power because God put them in those positions. And they're standing there, and they don't even realize what they're doing and who they're talking to. And Jesus just stands there and takes it. That marvels me in itself, because how many of us would stand there and take something like that without opening our mouth, trying to defend ourselves, trying to keep from being put to death, even knowing that it would help people, we still would struggle with that inwardly. It would be a fight, and here Jesus is taking it and not saying a word. So as we look at this passage, we're going to look at verse 1 and 2 of Mark, where it says that Jesus is taken to Pilate. Point number 1, Jesus is taken to Pilate. So we read those verses, and straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, carried him away, and delivered him to Pilate. Such an interesting, I was reading that verse and thinking back to last week as we were studying the trial before the high priest. And here Jesus had been taken in the night in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was taken out, taken to the chief priest's place, which is so interesting to me that he was able to get all these men together and have this council against Jesus late into the evening. We don't know exactly the time frame. Maybe some of you that are Jewish historians and scholars know the answers to those questions. I didn't study that deep into it to know that. I don't know if we can know that. But sometime during the night, this is all taking place. They get to the point where we end up in chapter verse number 65 of chapter 14, And they begin to spit on him and cover his face and hit him and buffet him and saying to him, prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands, and they're beating Jesus. And all this is taking place. And I think at some point during the night, this begins to stop and wane away. Jesus is probably left out in a courtyard through the night. And we come to the morning hours, and we see here in verse number 1 of chapter 15 that in the morning they get a council together again against Jesus to decide what to do with him. So they bound him up and they said, let's take him to Pilate because we can't put him to death. We'll be guilty of murder if we do it. But if we take him to Pilate, and Pilate will listen to us and hear our accusations, Pilate can have him put to death. And I was really thinking about this and looking at this timing. Because they could have waited until later in the day, couldn't they have? They could have done it, like, well, let's wait till afternoon or mid-morning. Let's get some breakfast and, we'll deal with him in a little bit. But they were so anxious to get rid of Jesus. And possibly they thought, if we wake up Pilate and get him up early, he won't want to mess with this and he'll push it through. Oh, yeah, gee, I'll do whatever you want. I don't care. Yeah, he's guilty. Stamp, done, walk away. I kind of had that imagination going on in my mind as I was reading this narrative. And we go down through here and we can go over to Matthew chapter 27 if you have your pages marked there. Matthew 27 verses 1 and 2. Basically, Matthew tells us the same account. It says, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So we see as they begin to step up the chain of command, we can get the governor to put him to death. We go over to the book of Luke. Luke gives us a lot of details concerning what's going on here. We get down to Luke chapter 22 and verse 66. It says, as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes come together to lead him into their council, saying, art thou the Christ? Tell us. And here we have, not only did they just get up in the morning and try and bound him and take him out, Luke gives us a little more details about this. They begin to question him again in the morning. No doubt hoping that because of the exhaustion and the late hour and the early hours and the beating and everything he suffered so far, that he would speak out. And he would condemn himself even more, and they would have more evidence to show to Pilate. Let's give it one more try, and then we'll have him for sure, and we can give this evidence to Pilate, and then Pilate will surely have him put to death. So they asked him, art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. Boy, he was right, wasn't he? All these years, he's been showing it and giving the evidence. They had the evidence. They read these scriptures. They know the prophecies of the Messiah and the signs of who he is. And when he was coming, they would recognize him. The problem is they didn't want Jesus to be the Messiah. They wanted a different kind of Messiah. They wanted one to come in and take over and deliver them from Rome, and then they would have their own kingdom. They didn't want somebody like Jesus who walked around and was calm and submitted to the local government and did all these things. And they didn't recognize the Messiah for who he was, who he is. And so we see here that they wouldn't believe him, and Jesus knew it. At this point, you didn't believe me up to now. Why would it make a difference if I told you now? Verse 68 says, and if I also ask you, you will not answer me nor let me go. You're not going to let me go anyways. You're out here to kill me. So why bother speaking to you? You've made your mind up. It doesn't make a difference at this point. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of God, the right hand of the power of God. Boy, that's amazing. We see what's going to happen. Jesus gives a little prophecy there. Tells us what's going to happen here in the near future as he goes after his death. Verse 70 goes on to say, then said they all, art thou the Son of God? And he said unto them, ye say that I am. You're saying that I am. We continue on, and they said, what need we any further witnesses? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth. They believe in their thinking that this man is blaspheming against God, saying he is God. That's their accusation that they bring to him. Because once again, they did not want Jesus to be the Messiah. So they're saying that he is blasphemy, saying he's God, because they don't believe he is. Chapter 23, we go into verse number 1, and we look at, as Luke continues, what's happening. And the whole multitude of them rose and led him unto Pilate. Excuse me. We go over to John chapter 18. We'll look at John's account as Jesus is being taken to Pilate. John chapter 18, verse 28, down through verse 38. I don't think we're going to read all of these in this setting for point 1. We might carry a few verses over to point 2. But here we have in verse number 28, then led they Jesus from Cyprus unto the hall of the judgment. Cyprus was the chief priest. And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And I looked into that one where it says, lest they be defiled, because the Jews believed if they went in and touched anything or something in the judgment hall, something was going, it wasn't a law against them going in there, but there was a law against them being defiled, and they weren't allowed to eat the Passover. And so they were concerned that if they went into the hall, there might be something in there in some way that they would be defiled, and then they would not legally be allowed to partake of the Passover. So they didn't go in, which is interesting. Verse 29 says, Pilate then went out unto them. So Pilate goes out of the hall. Instead of them coming into the hall, he goes outside with them. What accusations bring ye against this man? Verse 30 says, they answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee. So they begin to give false accusations against Jesus to Pilate. We'll come back over to this in point 2. I got my notes mixed up a little bit on the verses there. We'll come back over to this. But here, Jesus is brought to Pilate. The Jews have brought him there thinking, if we can twist this narrative of who this man is, if we can change what's going on and falsely accuse him, and Pilate believes us, then maybe we can get him put to death here and now this morning, and we'll be done of this man. He won't bother us anymore. He won't be turning our tables over in the temple and ruining our income. He won't be messing with our doctrine and our way of handling the people. He won't be messing up our way of life. We're going to get rid of him. So we get down to point number 2, and we see the accusations that are made. We just read there in John where Pilate asked, what accusations bring you against this man? So we go back to Mark chapter number 15 and verse number 3. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Here he is before Pilate, and they start accusing Jesus of different things, but yet Jesus answered not a thing. You go back to Mark and go down to verse number 12. We kind of skip over Matthew chapter 27, verse number 12. We kind of skipped over verses 3 down through verse 10. That talks about Judas there during this time. And you remember Judas went to the chief priest, and we'll go on his trail for just a moment. It's not in our notes, so this one's free. You got extra space at the bottom of the page. You can fill that in. But Judas went to the chief priest that night to turn Jesus in. They made a bargain. They set up a price. And we see it here. Judas, if you read down through these verses, and many of you have and understand it, he came back to him in verse 3 when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself, and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. He betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver. It baffles my mind that somebody would betray God for that. But yet people give up God for so many other things. So many things in our life. And you know, I was reading that verse, and I read it about 2 or 3 times, and I thought on a Christian side of that, because how can that apply to my life? And I thought, how many times do I betray Christ's love for me and what he did on the cross, and when I sin against him for just a little earthly pleasure or whatever it might be, indulging in sin? Sometimes I think of that. and think, wow, we think Judas betrayed him for such a little price. How much more do we betray him when we sin against him? And Judas tried to turn that in and clear his conscience, and the chief priest said, we can't take that money. We can't put it in the treasury. That's blood money. You just read through here and you think, wow, these men were incredible. So they decided they bought a field, a potter's field, and to bury strangers in. And to this day, it was called the Field of Blood. And it fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, of whom they of the children of Israel did value, and gave them for the potter's field as the Lord appointed me. Just so many prophecies that take place. And yet here's Judas, he betrayed Jesus, and it says in there that he went out and hung himself as a result of it. He couldn't handle what he had done to Christ, to Jesus. And there's a lot of speculation and talk about whether Judas was saved or not, or whether we'll see him in heaven, and we can talk about that after church if we want. That's another conversation for another day. But we go down through here and we get into verse number 12 where Jesus is accused, back to our point. Jesus is accused by the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and all these men. In verse 12 it says, and when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. We go back over to the book of Luke, where Luke gives us some more details. As we go down through here, and we look, John will give us a few more as well. But we go down through here and we look in Luke chapter number 23, starting in verse 2. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, thou sayest it. Wow, that was interesting. Hey, they're accusing Jesus, saying he is telling people not to give tribute to Caesar. Seems like I remember reading in our Bible as we went through Mark, in Matthew, where Jesus tells them to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God. Sounds like to me the chief priests are once again falsely accusing Jesus, trying to mock up a story to portray him as somebody he's not, because they didn't want him to be the Christ. There's an interesting turn of events during this accusation here in Luke, and we'll look at it since we're here. As you go down through there, in verse 4 it says, then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. Really, you guys say this, but I can't find a fault in him. I don't see this. I don't understand. I'm not seeing any problem with this. And I kind of was looking at this and thinking and putting myself in the time frame and what was happening. And here's Pilate early in the morning. He's outside the judgment hall talking to these men. They're just going off, throwing off accusations. There's no proof of it. And Pilate just wants to go eat breakfast. Like, look, I don't find any fault in him. There's nothing here. I don't know why you're bothering me with this. Well, the chief priests continue on. In verse 5 it says, and they were more furious, saying, he stirred up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. And I can see Pilate when they say that. Wait a minute. You said where? Where was he from? Because we see that in the next verse, in verse 6, where he says, Pilate heard of Galilee. He asked whether the man was a Galilee. Where did you say he was from? He's from Galilee. Whoa, that's outside my jurisdiction, guys. Y'all need to go see Herod. That's who you need to go see. You're in the wrong place. You're bothering me this morning. Y'all go on. And verse 7 says, and as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at the time. How convenient. Well, nothing's a coincidence with God, is it? And so here we have Jesus going to Herod, and we're going to hit that on our next point. So we're going to leave that one alone for the time being. But it's interesting to see this turn of event as he is accused by the Jews before Pilate. Let's go over to John chapter number 18. Go back over to John chapter number 18. And go down to verse number 20. Verse number 30. Verse 29, the Jews started accusing him. Verse 30 says, they answered, this is part of the accusations that we haven't had a lot of detail on yet. They answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee. So they're already calling him a criminal by referring to him as a malefactor. Then in verse 31, then said Pilate unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put to death. Verse 32, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, saying, what death he should die. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, art thou King of the Jews? So we get a little more narrative of what's going on during this accusation. Jesus is pulled into the judgment hall. Pilate tells him to come in the judgment hall. I imagine the chief priests and everybody are staying outside because they won't want to be defiled. So Pilate wants to talk to Jesus by himself, relatively by himself. They come into the judgment hall and they get in there and he asks Jesus, art thou King of the Jews? Verse 34 tells us, Jesus answered him, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Did you figure this out on your own, or are you just asking a question because that's what they're saying? Why are you asking me this? Pilate answered him, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and thy chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Why are you here? I can see Pilate trying to figure this out, going, I don't understand why you're here. It doesn't make sense to me. I've not heard of you doing anything to cause any problems as far as the Roman Empire goes. Now, the Jews, you apparently have upset them, but that's not a problem of mine. I'm not a Jew. It doesn't matter to me. You're not affecting the Roman Empire. I don't care. So why are you here? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Wasn't his time yet. His kingdom's not here yet. It's coming. It's coming one day. Looking forward to that day. But he said, my servants aren't going to fight because that's not why I'm here. Look at verse 37. Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou a king then? You said you have a kingdom. It's not here yet, but are you a king then? Thou sayest that I am a king. This is Jesus talking. To this end was I born. This is the whole purpose. Jesus was born. And for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. Boy, you want to know who Jesus is, you hear his voice, you understand it, you know who he is. Amazing thing. Verse 38, Pilate said to him, what is the truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and saith unto them, I find no fault in this man. And we're going to stop right there because we'll look at the remaining verses about Barabbas and all that later. But as we continue through, here's that accusation. The chief priests bring him before Pilate. Pilate says, I can't find any fault in this man. I've questioned him. I've brought him in. I've talked to him. There's nothing in here that he has done against the Roman Empire that I can put him, the reason for me to justify putting him to death. And you kind of read this and you're like, all right, he's going to get out. He's going to get out. That's where your mind goes. You know he's not because he can't. He has to sacrifice on the cross. But as we read through it and we see this events taking place, we go back to Luke chapter number 23. Point number 3 is as we go through this trial, Jesus is taken to Herod. We remember just a few moments ago we were reading there in Luke chapter 23 where Pilate realizes, hey, he's under Herod's jurisdiction. I don't really have the authority to deal with him. He's not my problem. He needs to go to Herod and let Herod deal with him. We see in verse number 8 of Luke 23, and when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him for a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he had hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Oh, Herod was excited to see him. Yeah, I finally get to see Jesus. Let's see what magic trick he can do for us. Herod did not care about who Jesus is. He did not care that he is the Messiah. Did not care anything about that. He just wanted to see some miracle done. He had no desire to really have his life changed by this man, by Christ. And we look at that, and I think about that verse and think about so many people who want God to do something great in their life, but they want God to work some magical miracle in their life. They don't want God to change their life. They don't want to give up who they are for Christ. They don't want to be saved. They just want God to make their life easier and better. So many people are that way. Verse number 9, then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. Jesus didn't say a word. Pilate, or Herod, all you want is to see me do a miracle. I'm not bothering answering you. You can ask me all the questions you want. I'm going to stand here quietly. Verse 10, and the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Here they are getting furious and began to accuse Jesus. Probably the same accusations that they had told Pilate. I would imagine they had this lie rehearsed and pretty well down by now, that they were repeating it over and over again. Verse 11 says, and Herod with his men of war set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him with a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. He didn't care. He didn't care about our Savior. He said, you know what? He ain't going to answer me. We're just going to make fun of him and put a, here, go get this robe, throw on him. We'll mock him and make fun of him and send him back to Pilate. He's not our problem. He won't answer us. He won't do anything. He's not going to do what I want him to do. He's not going to put on a show for me and heal somebody or do anything fun. So we might as well send him back to Pilate. I don't want to deal with him. What an attitude to have towards Jesus. Isn't it? Just amazing. Amazing the way these people acted. We get down into our last point, and Jesus is pronounced sentence by Pilate. This is kind of interesting here. So here you get back over, we're staying here in Luke chapter 23, and we see this sentence pronounced by Pilate. You go down and continue into verse 12. In the same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. I thought that was an interesting verse to put in. Here Jesus is before these two men. Neither one of them seemed to want to deal with Jesus in any aspect or take responsibility for him. And as a result, they become friends. It's kind of interesting. I guess birds of a feather flock together statement kind of holds true. Neither one of them wanted anything to do with Jesus, so now they had something in common and they wanted to be around each other. If one of them had accepted Jesus as being the Messiah and being the Savior and knew who he was, I don't think they would have become friends. But anyways, we move on from there in verse number 13. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people, and behold, I have examined him before you, have found no fault in this man, touching those things whereof ye accuse him. So here you've brought him in and you've accused him before me, but I find none of your accusations to be true. Basically, he's calling them a liar, because that's what they were doing. In verse 15, No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. Even when Herod couldn't find anything, there's two judges have looked at him and said he's clear. There's nothing wrong with him. He has done no wrong. We cannot put him to death. You are bringing false accusations to me. There's nothing I can do with him. In verse 16, you see the sentence that Pilate gives to Jesus at this time. It says, I will therefore chasten him and release him. We're going to give him a slap on the wrist, tell him don't do it again, and send him on his way. Now, I can imagine the Jews standing there, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, and all the effort, all the work that they have gone through up to this point. They've coerced and manipulated Judas, and Satan has entered Judas, and Judas betrayed Jesus. They had to deal with the whole money issue. They had to find people to go with Judas to get Jesus. They got up late that night, and got up early the morning to take him. They've gone to Pilate. Pilate didn't do what they wanted to as fast. Pilate sent them to Herod. They had to go find Herod and bring him before Herod and set up all of that. And now they're back at Pilate again. And Pilate says, well, I can't find any fault in him. I'm just going to chasten him and send him on his way. And the aggravation that those men must have had. I know what that's like. If we have it kind of easy here in the States as far as getting things done logistically. I've been in other countries, and you don't know what it's like to walk in a place thinking you have everything lined up, and you walk in and they go, oh no, you don't have this paper. You need to go see so-and-so. Well, where is their office at? Oh, it's downtown. Where downtown? It's downtown. Okay, thank you. And then you spend 2 days trying to find the office, another 2 or 3 days trying to get an appointment to walk in there, and they go say, oh, I'm not the person you need to see. You need to go. It's very aggravating. You can imagine how frustrated the high priest and them were when they get back and Pilate says, oh, there's nothing I'm going to do to him. I'm going to release him. The frustration, the anger that must have welled up inside of them at that point. And we see as it goes on, in verse 17, he says, I'll release him. Verse 17 says, for of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. It was part of their tradition, their law, that he would release one. And we kind of end the whole account at this point. We kind of want to leave it in suspense. Y'all know what happens. I don't need to read on. You know what goes on. But as we think about it, I want us to go away this week and sit here and think about what Jesus is going through for us at this time. All of these accusations standing before Pilate and the Jews, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the men who should know and understand who Jesus is and be on his side are over here accusing him falsely of being somebody he's not. And he opens not his mouth. He goes before two judges, Pilate and Herod. The same thing happens in both cases, and he says nothing. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't try to justify anything he's done or say they're lying, that's not what happened, this is what happened. And doesn't do any of that for the sole and only purpose is so that he could go to the cross to be the sacrifice for our sins. What an amazing thought. Here he is down to the last, and it looks like at this point that he'll be released. But we know he can't be. We know it won't happen. You've read the Bible. You know what's going to happen. I'm going to leave us in suspense there, what little bit you'll have for the rest of the week. But just think about this week, what Jesus is going through. All of these things happening. And he's doing this for you and I's salvation, for this world's salvation. And so many times as I read this and think about what Jesus is going through for us, and here we are, his servants. We talked about being Christ-like this morning and living a life that's pleasing to God and being more like Christ. How much should we go through to reach somebody for Christ? Man, every time I read this, I think here Jesus is going through all these things for us. And our job is to be an example of Christ. What can we go through to reach the soul for Christ? To reach somebody for Christ? Yeah. You know, sometimes we get frustrated. Sometimes we're like, oh, this is too hard, or I don't have time, or this is aggravating, or it's too this. We come up with reasons and excuses and so on and so forth. But what can we suffer through and go through to reach somebody for Christ? To continue to go on and tell them about Christ. Sometimes it takes that humiliation to say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to answer you. You know, I'm a child of God. I'm a Christian. I want to be pleasing to my Lord. And sometimes it takes public and social separation. People don't accept us because we're Christians. They don't like us. Yet we still go out. We still tell people about Christ. You still witness to people when you're out and about. You're in the grocery store and you have I know you do. I know you do. And we still go out and we still tell people. We don't quit. We keep going. We keep pushing forward. If Jesus could go through this for us, I think we can keep pushing forward and keep serving Him through what little bit of troubles and trials that we face here in this world, in this area that we live in. Amen. What a great account as we look at Jesus' journey to the cross. Next week we'll look at what happens after Pilate says, I'm going to release Jesus. And we'll look at that next week as we continue through the book of Mark and studying the life of Christ. All right, what a great account for us. What a challenge. What an interesting passage to read. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll close and we'll be dismissed. Dear Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the time that we could come together and read your word and study. And thank you for standing there and answering nothing so that we could be saved. Sometimes we read through those passages and we don't think about what you were doing there for us, but we thank you tonight, Lord, for what you did. We ask, Lord, that you'd help us to be more dedicated to reaching people for Christ. Help us to be more dedicated to you in our daily walk, in our service for you. And we ask, Lord, that you be with us as we go our way tonight, that you keep us safe. Thank you for the good report we heard about Miss Linda earlier. And we ask, Lord, that you just continue to work in her life and her body, along with her granddaughter Rachel and Brother Bill Metcalf, that you would work in a special way through this injection that's coming up this week. We ask that you keep the Lilies safe as they travel back. And we ask these things in your name. Amen. All right, you're dismissed.